All right, that's enough of that. That's enough of that. Just firing things up, guys. We're gonna get started here in just a second. Today, we're gonna be talking about Musaeus of Athens, or potentially is he Moses of the Hebrew tradition? Not sure, but we will be checking it out. I'm just gonna give people a chance to trickle in here. I'm not sure if anybody's in here watching yet. Um, But yeah, like I said, we are going to be firing off on Musaeus of Athens, who is the alleged student of Orpheus. And since most of what I've been talking about on this channel thus far has been Orphism, I figured this was a good place to start. Start with the first Orphic hymn of the Orphic corpus. Uh, in most of the collations that we have now, most of the collections, the first hymn that we see is massive hymn to somebody called Musaeus, and it's kind of out of place. It's a little different than all the rest of uh, the hymns. All the other hymns are directly related to a specific cosmic force, a specific deity, but this hymn to Musaeus is like this masterwork piece. It's this giant um, kind of super prayer, if you will. It's like a super prayer that combines all of the different deities that you're going to find within the Orphic hymns and the Orphic corpus there. And it's really intriguing. So I figured, why not kick things off, since we're still talking about all things Orphism, with some Orphic hymns instead of sticking with the Rhapsodies. So who is this dude? Who is this Musaeus of Athens, and who's Moses? Are these dudes the same dude? So Musaeus of Athens is this polymath dude. He's a philosopher, historian, prophet, seer, priest, poet, magician and musician. He's kind of jack of all trades, which is just the case of about everybody in the Hellenic world, and this would probably be pre-Hellenic world when we're thinking about Musaeus of Athens. He's the composer of hymns and treatises and oracular responses of the gods. There's an entire collection of oracles attributed to Musaeus, which we don't have, but you can probably bet that most of what we get passed down to us from the Temple of Apollo, the oracles there, are probably some variant of Musaeus back in the day. Musaeus held just about as much sway in the Hellenic or the Platonic world as Orpheus and Hesiod and Homer. And so we're looking at this student of Orpheus, or potentially in some cases teacher of Orpheus, who is very well regarded within the Hellenic world. And we're going to be taking a deeper look into him. So he's like a theologian. I think he's less of a theologian than, say, Orpheus is. Orpheus is like the tip top of the guiding theologians, but he's definitely a poet. And a prophet and a seer. I think he kind of illustrates this idea of poet and seer more so in the Greek side of things. But then you see all of these other pieces come in when we start to introduce the possibility that we're talking about Moses here as well. So I'm going straight to the text today to show what the writers and authors of this period had to say about Musaeus, because there's a lot of good stuff on the internet and there's a lot of bad stuff on the internet, and I want to stick with what we know, right? So Diodorus Siculus states about Musaeus: he having sailed around the Adriatic Sea and having crossed the aforementioned gulf on foot, set out for Epirus, from which he went to the Peloponnese, and having completed the 10th race, received an order from Eurystheus to lead Cerberus from Hades to the light. So there's some sort of an underworld journey happening here. And this is kind of going back into what we are going to find out is his connection to Eleusis. Now, the Eleusinian rites also have that overlap with the Orphic tradition. There's this underworld catabasis ritual that they're engaging in. They're very concerned with what we do when we go into the underworld after death, which is something that we see from the Egyptian um, roots that all of these share. Um, and so there's these ties that we're already seeing. He's at Eleusis, right? So he went to Athens and participates in the mysteries of Eleusis under the leadership of Musaeus, son of Orpheus, who was then the leader of the ceremony. So we see this piece from Diodorus Siculus. He's not talking necessarily about Musaeus in the beginning of this. What he is talking about is this person who he's describing. I forget who it was. I had to put this together really fast. But he's saying this person went on this journey and then went and undertook the Eleusinian mysteries under the leadership of Musaeus, the son of Orpheus, who was then the leader of the ceremony. There are other instances here where he is the son of Immopulus and Selene. So he's particularly a deity, which we see from Orpheus too. Orpheus being the son of a muse. So what we're talking about is some sort of potential demigod figure here. And Musaeus, his sire, Immolpius, in Falarian soil, is part of the Immolpidae. And these are mythic demigodic figures in Athens, and they get their name from the father Musaeus. So we see again this representation of Musaeus as something more than just a mere figure, a mere man, and is specifically being regarded as someone of providence, of authority, that when referenced clearly states he knows what's up. So we're going to see a lot of different things as we go through this, where people point to Musaeus just like they point to Orpheus or Hesiod as being an authority figure that is worth listening to. There are other pieces that suggest he's from Thrace, which aligns with the Orphic tradition, somewhere in Samothrace and somewhere just in general, not in Greece. So there's a non-Grecian element going on here. Musaeus is also the son or disciple of Orpheus. We've already seen that in Diodorus Siculus, but also in Tatian, who's then there's some saying about where. So let's look at some of these Orphic fragments that go way back. In Egypt at that time, Homer learned other skills along with Orpheus. um, Highly esteemed by Orpheus. So in this Orphic fragment, we get a piece from the Byzantine poet and grammarian Tzetzes. So this is dating back to 1180 CE potentially, where this dude is talking about Homer and Orpheus. So we've got Orpheus being referenced all the way back to 1200 here almost, which puts him way back there, 12th, 13th century, which is where we find Moses, which is we're going to get to that. It's coming up. In the next fragment from Diodorus, for they say that Orpheus, upon visiting Egypt and participating in the initiation mysteries of Dionysus, adopted them, and as a favor to the descendants of Cadmus, he was kindly disposed to them, and received honors at their hands, transferred the birth of the god to Thebes and the common people, partly out of ignorance and partly out of their desire to have the god thought to be a Greek, eagerly accepted his initiatory rites and mysteries. What Diodorus is getting at here is that Orpheus got these rituals from traveling abroad in different places. Specifically, Egypt is where we're going to find a lot of this statement going forward. Even into the Common Era, we have people referencing that Orpheus, Homer, Plato, Pythagoras, Moses all participated in Egyptian mysteries. And then you see this begin to fragment into different cultural perspectives about different people's takes, different cultures' takes on what the Egyptians were doing with their funerary and mystical rites. In fragment 96, it says Orpheus, for instance, brought from Egypt most of his mystic ceremonies, the orgiastic rites that accompanied his wanderings, and his fabulous account of his experiences in Hades. So, again, there's that underworld journey. For the rite of Osiris is the same as that of Dionysus, and that of Isis very similar to that of Demeter. The names alone have been interchanged, and the punishments in Hades of the unrighteous, the field of the righteous, which is like the field of reeds in the Egyptian, and the fantastic conceptions current among the many, which are figments of the imagination, all these were introduced by Orpheus in imitation of the Egyptian funeral customs. That fragment there is also from Diodorus. And so we see that all of these mystery traditions from Eleusis, from Greece, that basically produce the Kykeon, produce this Eleusinian mystery tradition, are all stemming from Egypt. And they're from a time well before Eleusis is established. Because Eleusis is being stated here as established through Orpheus bringing these mysteries from Egypt north. Now, Plato has something to say about this too, as he usually does. He says, great jealousies are aroused by his proceedings, and he is the subject of many enmities and conspiracies. Now, the art of the sophist is, as I believe, of great antiquity, but in ancient times those who practiced it, fearing this odium, veiled and disguised themselves under various names, some under that of poets, as Homer, Hesiod, Simonides, and of hierophants and prophets, such as Orpheus and Musaeus. Now, this is interesting because it's not just poets, right? He references the Homer, Hesiod, Simonides as poets, but he references Orpheus and Musaeus as hierophants and prophets, which is very, very intriguing, very important because, as we know, Moses is the primary lawgiver of the Hebrews, and so is Orpheus and Musaeus a lawgiver for the Greeks. That is not from the Byzantine. That is from Plato on Protagoras. I did not clean up that text there. But let's fast forward a little bit. Now we're moving into the Common Era with Eusebius, who is a Christian apologist. And he says, so then these were the men chosen by the people of Egypt as fit to stand beside Musaeus, who led forth the Jews, a man who was most powerful in prayer to God, and the plagues which Musaeus brought upon Egypt, these men showed themselves able to disperse the most violent. But the Greeks he was called, when grown to manhood, Musaeus. So Eusebius is conflating them. Eusebius is saying, basically reaching back through time and saying, no, our guy Moses is the same as the dude that you guys are talking about here in Greece as Musaeus. So not only is there an antique statement of it going back to 1180 CE, we have fragments. We have fragments showing up later in the Common Era with Eusebius, and this is really interesting because you see a flip flop. You see in antiquity Hellenic writers stating that Musaeus is the same as Moses. And there's this acceptance that these guys are one and the same, perhaps not always one and the same, but they're basically of the same flock, of the same ilk, if you will. And then you see sort of flip flop as the Hellenic world starts to Judaize, as monotheism starts to take over. You see them flip it to support the claims of the monotheistic switch. They're like, see, we've got your guy too. You can look at this as a piece of authority. So whatever we're writing about Moses, you already know because you're familiar with Musaeus, and it's really interesting to see this flip happen where it was Moses is Musaeus, and before that Musaeus is Moses. So it's definitely not something that's a new invention. We have seen it in Christian apologetics as the monotheistic switch happens, and we see it well before. So let's look at Moses here. So Strabo points out that he's an Egyptian priest who possessed a portion of the country of Lower Egypt, which is not something you learn in your Sunday school class. But being dissatisfied with the establishment and the institutions there, left it and came to Judea with a large body of people who worshipped the divinity. So this, I think, is really interesting because the stories we're told in Western culture about Moses. I mean, I've seen so many people talk about even the movie with Moses, the cartoon movie that we're all fed as kids, where Moses is in with the Pharaoh, raised with them alongside them, and then he commits the murder and he runs off to the desert. People in antiquity had a very different idea of what Moses was doing. In some cases, potentially taking over the country. There's all this talk about a gigantic outbreak of leprosy happening around this time, where primarily the Hebrews were the afflicted party. They hung out in the temples, kind of just like as vagrants. And at a certain point, the Egyptian pharaoh, who takes over after the first one of this period dies of elephantiasis or something, ships them all out, basically deports them all for being sickly. And we see out of this pandemic of sorts that's happening among this group of people that are foreigners in a different land, hanging out in these temples. They get ejected out into the desert and begin to engage with this Moses dude, this guy who has all of these strange purificatory rites to basically clean up the leprosy. Where does he get those? Where does he get all this? Well, Hecataeus says after the establishment of settled life in Egypt in early times, which took place according to the mythical account in the period of the gods and the heroes, the first to persuade the multitudes to use written laws was Menves, a man not only of great of soul, but also in his life the most public spirited of all lawgivers whose names are recorded. Now you see a ton of different spellings, variations of Moses all over the place, whether it's Moches. There's a great piece by George Van Kooten, an academic who talks about the different roots of Moses and the selection of the name of Yahweh and Yahoo. And I'm going to link it in the video description of this after I'm done with the live. But we see many different variations, many different spellings of Moses. And so there's not one set way of looking at this. You have to look at it tradition by tradition, because all of these cultures have markers of this particular figure doing slightly different things, but holding basically the same narrative. Out of Egypt comes these people, and these people are led by this figure, and this figure has specific mystery rites that he is bringing with him wherever he goes. Artapanus, he's another apologist that we find in the Common Era, states the jealousy of Moses' excellent qualities induced, I'm going to murder this name, so I'm just going to skip it, who is the pharaoh of the time, to send him with unskilled troops on a military expedition to Ethiopia, where he won great victories. So we've got Moses as this potential war lord after building the city of Hermopolis, which is interesting. That is where we find Thoth, the Ogdoadic tradition, which Moses is also in some writings associated with. Really interesting because many of us know Thoth, Hermes, Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great. Are we talking about the same guy here? But there are some writings from antiquity that state that Moses is the same as Thoth, and that's where we're getting at here. He taught the people the value of the ibis as a protection against the serpents, making the bird the sacred guardian of the city. Then he introduces circumcision, after which he returns to Memphis, and Moses taught the people the value of oxen for agriculture. So he's teaching agriculture, and the consecration of the same by Moses gave rise to the cult of Apis, the cult of the bull, the cult of Osiris in Egypt. So we see this going way beyond what we learn in Bible school, way beyond what we see in our Sunday school, in the myths in general, in these general story of Moses. This is an apologist in the Common Era reaching back in time and saying Moses is basically this god of Egypt. Essentially, that is his reference. He's basically trying to lend credence to the arising of this monotheistic tradition in a Judaizing Hellenic world. And he's reaching back in time, and it's kind of a reach. It's kind of a reach. Like, yeah, actually, Moses was Toth. I don't know, man. He's under a lot of suspect, anyways. Not very many people respect what he had to say. At least that's what I found in my in my research here. So we continue. A statement that Moses was the first wise man, that he taught the alphabet to the Jews, who passed it on to the Phoenicians, who passed it on to the Greeks, and that Moses first wrote the laws for the Jews. Now, this is another apologist, basically stating that Moses comes up with the alphabet. We know very well that the Phoenician alphabet came first now, historically, before we have the Hebraic alphabet, and the Hebraic alphabet is based on the Phoenician, and so is the Greek. So, how much credence we can give to this is kind of suspect. Numenius refers to Moses simply as the prophet, and Homer as the poet. Plato is described as the Greek Moses. And so this is in antiquity, this is a giant game of who's who. And this is why a historical figure being stated as basically accepted. There's a scholarly consensus that Moses existed, that Musaeus existed, that these dudes were not just legendary, but potentially historical. But you have hundreds of authors just completely conflating the issue and saying these wild things about this character. Philo of Alexandria is one of the main proponents of basically this switch. He's one of the uh, Hellenic Jews in Alexandria who's writing around the time of the Common Era, the switch from BC to the Common Era. And he positions Moses as this figure back in time because he's essentially trying to give the Hebrew people some credence in this Hellenic world. And Philo's really interesting in the way he does this. I definitely think that he had the best of intentions. His writing seems very clear about what his intentions were at the very least. He wanted to give his people a place in the Hellenic world. He blends a lot of the different elements of the Neoplatonism, of Platonism in general, into what we now kind of receive in the Western esoteric tradition. But he positions him as a scientist, an artist, a philosopher. He basically positions Moses as an Egyptian master, um, which is really interesting because most people do not think of him as Egyptian. They think of him as a Hebrew who was just in Egypt for a time and then just got rid of all of the traditions. Doesn't seem like it. Now they do diverge, and we will get to that. Now, Josephus makes some really interesting claims. Josephus, another apologist in the Common Era, says it is said that the priest who gave them a constitution and a code of laws was a native of Heliopolis. So, where are you from, Moses? Hermopolis, Heliopolis, these are two different places, named Osarsiph, after the Heliopolitan god Osiris. Now, what did we say before about Musaeus? Learned the Egyptian mysteries of Osiris, who they called Dionysus in Greece. And that when he went over this, the people changed his name, and he changed his name and was called Moses. Now, he continues in this against Apion. Moses prescribes certain rites of purification to cleanse himself in a bath of spring water, to cut off all the hair, to basically engage in numerous varieties of sacrifices before entering the holy city. Now remember, Moses is essentially wanting to lead the people out of Egypt. Moses doesn't get to see the eventual setup of the temple. The tabernacle is set up when they're wandering in the wilderness after and during this whole 40 years in the desert. Moses never gets to see, at least according to the Torah, the Tanakh. He dies before this comes into fruition. But it's obvious that he's setting up what the laws, what the rituals are supposed to be with this temple before it comes. Numerous varieties of sacrifices before entering the holy city. All these things had to be accomplished before entering the holy city. He goes on to talk about this, and there's an etymological connection between the names as well that I'm going to draw out next. His true name means one saved out of water. That's what Moses means, according to Josephus. And we'll see it in the next piece. But there's a connection here. Orpheus writes, "In the soul is water, and death is a return to water. From water comes earth, and back from earth again water. Now from that the soul is the altering of the whole of the aether." This is an Orphic metaphor for going back to the Orphic Rhapsodies, what we've talked about in the previous videos of Phanes and Nyx. Orpheus states that the primordial material is mud and water. Talks about it again here. Now, these are from the Orphic gold tablets, which are katabatic underworld rituals. They're carved into these gold tablets that were positioned with people in their funerary rites. The people are buried with them. There is this statement of water purification. The Orphics are known to use water quite often in some sort of kind of proto-baptism, which again stretches back to Egypt. This is where they're getting the rites. In one of my other videos, I talk about the water purification rites that the pharaohs undergo in the pyramid texts. So we see a clear line of Moses, Musaeus, the Orphic tradition, the Hebrew tradition, going back to this water purification rite. What's interesting about this is, again, this is Josephus talking about this leprosy outbreak that happened in Egypt, and that Moses was the one who led the Hebrew people out of Egypt, gave them these purification rites, perhaps to get rid of the leprosy, or perhaps it's a mystical thing. But there's definitely some weird overlay there, because we talk about the plagues. It's listed in the Torah that Moses brings on these plagues, but is he also the deliverer of the plagues? In the Torah, it's described that Moses delivers the plagues, the boils, the leprosy. In Exodus, it says that he brings this on. But then we have other writers from the time saying that this is a pre-existing condition, something that's going on. Then Moses shows up, leads these people out of there, and then provides the purification rite. Just like there's some Orphic purification rites that deal with water. Now, everybody has some sort of water purification. Almost every culture around the world, you're going to have something that's the nature of water itself. But is it a bridge too far to say that this dude whose name is one saved out of water, who's participating in a time where there's a leprosy outbreak, provides people with the specific purification rites from Egypt to give them freedom from either death or from a particular disease? I don't think so. So let's look at these Orphic water rites that I'm talking about. So the Petelia gold tablets, found near Toten Pass in southern Italy, they clearly state, "You will find a spring on your left in Hades' halls, and by it the cypress with its luminous sheen. Do not go near this spring or drink of its water. You will find another cold water flowing from Memory's lake. Its guardians stand before it. You say, 'I am a child of earth and starry heaven, but descended from heaven. You yourselves know this. I am parched with thirst and dying. Quickly give me methe, cool water, flowing from Memory's lake. And they will give you water from the sacred spring, and then you will join the heroes at their rites. This is the memory at the point of death.'" And then you basically include different parts of your name within this tablet, and this is what they would take with them into their burial. This lines up with a lot of what the Egyptian funerary and mystical tradition engage in, whether it is a mystical underworld journey taken while living or a funerary journey. My own personal belief on this is that during life, you are mystically trained what to do when dying, when under the spell of death, to basically break free of this cycle of being put back in this reincarnation, being put back in a body here in order to advance to a place of paradise, whether it's the field of reeds, whether it's this Elysium, fields of Elysium for the Orphics, for the Greeks, or if it's heaven, which is what comes out of the Christian theology. They're all very fixated on during life, you must undergo these mystic rites so that you are trained for when the time comes what to do, because there are a set of trials that you will have to undertake in order to basically move on. It's really intriguing. They were all very obsessed with this idea of immortality, and immortality through like passcodes and knowing the sacred names. It's really intriguing. So let's look at this etymological connection. So there's phonetic similarities. Anybody can look at it and say Musaeus, Moses, and go, wow, yeah, that's the same guy. But let's go a little deeper, because different languages have different roots, different things. So Moses says being drawn from the water, while Musaeus is connecting to the muse. Now, at first, you can look at that and go, not the same thing, right? Moses, drawn from the water, Musaeus, basically born of the muse. Well, what's interesting about this is drawn from the water does, we've already kind of covered that with the tablets. It it harkens back to the traditions of Orphism. And all of Orphism is based on this connection to the muses. And in the Greek mythology, in the Greek religion, the muses are often associated with water fountains, rivers, they're water nymphs, and they are the well of inspiration that the poets who are writing these hymns, who are writing these theogonies, these descriptions of these mystical encounters with the gods, and this cosmology that they're putting together are all drawn from this watery inspiration. So there's a symbolic connection here. It may not be as linguistically solid as we'd like it to be, but if you look at the symbolism a little bit deeper, there's a resonance between the two. Even to the point of this pre Socratic idea of the soul being moist, this connection of water being this life giving inspiration. Without the water, the soul, if it's just built of, let's say, what the Orphics say, mud, of dirt, it's inert, it's dry. The water is the life giving element. And so if Moses is this person drawn from the water, and Musaeus is this one drawn from the womb, the watery womb of a muse, then I would say you have a pretty strong connection between the two on a symbolic level. So this dude, Musaeus, he's this polymath. He's got a scarcity of biographical details. We have a lot more biographical details, I think, about Moses, and I think that's just a product of what has been lost to time as the traditions shifted. And then both of them have this mythical and legendary persona. But they're both captivating figures, and they both have their place in this talk. So I'm going to go back to Musaeus for a little bit. He's attributed to writing a number of things that we basically don't have. We have almost nothing of his, and that's again probably just due to the popularity of the monotheistic emergence and the preservation of those texts over the preservation of a fringe element. So he has a number of hymns that are attributed to him, some prose, some treatises, and mostly these oracular oracles, this oracular responses from the gods. Like I said, most of it's lost. There is some attribution to a guy named Onomacritus, who essentially was tasked by a certain ruler to put these oracles in order, And then what happens is he's basically called out by a bunch of other dudes at the time saying, no, these are all fake. These are not the inspired works of Musaeus. These aren't there. But what I think is really interesting, and we'll get into this, is the difference between, say, the law-giving absolute commandments that are handed down by this lawgiver and theologian in Moses, and these kind of ambiguous oracles that are given by Musaeus. Musaeus is giving these poetic, very ephemeral statements from the gods. He's acting as an intermediary between the gods and humans and delivering the oracles, the wants, desires of the gods to the humans. Where on the other hand, we have Moses, who is giving these absolute statements, these 10 commandments, all these different laws and numbers in Deuteronomy of how to live according to the divine. Both are acting as intermediaries, but through extremely different cultural lenses. Whereas the Hebrews have this very rigid absolute statement, the Greeks have a completely different take on it. Outside of the oracles, he also has the poem of Hero and Leander, which I'm going to have to do a piece on because it's really interesting. There's Hero is a priestess of Aphrodite, and she lives on one end of the river of Hellespont, and then Leander is this Egyptian guy who's in love with her, and he will sneak across the river from time to time to go lay with her, to be with her. They're in love. It's like one of the first love stories, which of course, Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus has to go across the river Styx. It's a callback, I think, to the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. Hero and Leander. Essentially, in the poem, what happens is uh, she puts on her light one night, and that was basically the signal for him to come. And what happens is a storm brews. I think Poseidon gets wind of it, and there's this idea that the gods are kind of like intervening in their love affair, and Leander dies. He's swimming across the channel when the storm breaks. He drowns. She sees it. She jumps into the water to join him, and they both die. So it's like proto Romeo and Juliet, this classic tale of forbidden love. A tragic story, which is attributed to Musaeus. However, the version that we have, there's a lot of contestation of whether or not it was specifically Musaeus. It's attributed to him, but the version we have, I think, is probably not his. So we have all of these writings from Moses and nothing from Musaeus. Basically nothing except for what the writers of antiquity said were extant at their time. Why this wild divergence between the Greek culture of Musaeus and the Hebrew and Hellenizing Judaism that comes up out of the Hellenic world? Well, let you do the work and the math on that one, because I think what it is just that as that monotheistic interpretation started to come about, the other pieces didn't have as much relevance to those people living in that time, and there's plenty of desire to wipe out some of those elements as well. We see that happen from time to time. If nothing else, just don't carry them forward. Let them rot. It was, I think, that probably the general idea of things as they continued. So, who was it? Who came first? Musaeus, the disciple and successor of Orpheus? In some cases, they have Moses as the teacher. It's hard to know. It's hard to know. But what we do know is that we're talking about Musaeus and Moses. Maybe Orpheus and Moses are around at the same time as well. There's an association of the divine with revelation. There's influences theologians and lawgivers. There's the absolute prominence of them in their respective traditions. Both of them are held above, head and above everybody else when it comes to giving the law. And they have these etymological and symbolically resonant names. So going into this, there's this shift, right? This figure of Musaeus, he's prominent, but he's this kind of like, we don't even know what he said figure in one side, and then we have this complete shift in perception of this from poet to absolute theologian. And this happens over time. And I wonder, because there are older fragments, there are older poetry attributed to Moses in the Hebrew tradition. And I'm going to probably do a piece on this later to see if there's any correlation between the early poems of Moses that go way back before we have any evidence of the Torah, these just kind of fragmentary pieces, to see if there's anything Orphic within them, to see if there is a deeper connection. I didn't have time to do that, but I promise I will do it in a future piece. But there is this shift from poet to theologian, which is really interesting. The poets, they stopped being important to people at some point, and it's a damn shame. This is an interesting piece from one of the Christian church fathers that we find in the Orphic fragments. And what's really intriguing about it, in my opinion, is we don't even have their name of who said this, but I thought it was a great piece, so I thought I'd bring it here. He says, "For I think that some of you, when you read even carelessly the history of Diodorus and of those others who wrote these things, cannot fail to see that both Orpheus and Homer and Solon, who wrote the laws of the Athenians, and Pythagoras and Plato, and some others, when they had been in Egypt, had taken advantage of the history of Moses afterwards, published doctrines concerning the gods quite contrary to those formerly which they had erroneously promulgated." So this is this shift, this discrediting that's starting to take place as the church gains prominence. They're reaching back in time and saying, "See, you just misunderstood all these people. You didn't know how to read it right, and these people were all ripping off Moses." And it's like, dude, we have people way before you attributing both of them to be similar. And so this attitude of "you guys got it all wrong" is one of the things that's the most wrong about monotheism in general and how it approaches things. Reaching back into history to demonize, to twist the narrative in such a way is really careless. That's what's careless, unnamed anonymous church father. So let's look at the dates. When were they supposed to have lived? Scholarly consensus puts Moses at around 13th century BCE. Rabbinical Judaism corroborates that. It's somewhere in this time frame between 1391 and 1271 BCE. But what's funny is church father Lactantius states that Orpheus was among the Greeks, attested to have lived at the time of the Trojan War, 12th to 13th century BCE. We have a church father directly utilizing Orpheus at this time, when he writes this, to give credence to what he's saying. This dude is way back there, and he uses it in other pieces. You can tell, to basically say what I'm saying is real. And this is what I'm talking about with pseudo apocrypha, where people use the name of a theologian like Moses, like Plato, like Orpheus, to give credence and authority to what they're writing. And they all of them are doing this at this time, but I think it's really interesting that they're straight up a church father stating Orpheus lived at this time, same time as Moses. So what is I always get this wrong, pseudo-epigraphy? Well, it's writings that are falsely attributed to ancient figures to gain authority in your text. Both Musaeus and Moses were used to lend credibility to later works. Musaeus was used for oracles, poems, theological treatises attributed to him long after his death. The same thing happened with Moses. And the way we know this is because we have pieces that we can date that are across times that these guys could not have been alive in. You can't be alive for 1,000 years, or can you? I don't know. But ultimately, that's what we're looking at from a historical perspective, is these texts show up over such a long span of time that we know, and then we can go in, and the grammarians of that time are really good at pointing out that's not the way this dude wrote, that's not the way he spoke, that's obviously somebody else, or that comes from this time because that word was not yet developed, and we don't find it in any other writings until this period of time. So what we see in this world is authors writing a text, slapping the name of Orpheus, Moses, pick a character of that time period, slapping the name on it, kind of like a James Patterson novel. I wrote this, I promise. But it was it was either for some in that time period, it was looked at as play. Most, it was an accepted practice. So when we're talking about all of these pieces, we cannot say with certainty who wrote what. We simply can't. Now, everybody has their perspectives, and many of the writers, the historians of that time period, will be very clear in stating this is we think is accurate. But we see this even with Paul. Paul is attributed with writing certain things here and there, but then later on we have scholars going, yeah, that probably wasn't him. That somebody just slapped his name on it to give it credence. It's the we call it the antique James Patterson effect. If you want to sell a lot of novels in the Hellenized world, you got to slap Orpheus or Musaeus's name on it, or else it won't matter. But what does this matter to us? When we see a name like this associated with a specific text, it distorts our understanding of them, but it also gives us an idea of how important that figure was to the culture at large. And so, this idea of authorship being set in stone, when we're looking at these things, at least with a keen eye, we have to be aware that there's sometimes some chicanery going on here. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit here to talk about the Orphic hymn to Musaeus. And wow, I've already eaten up that much time. That's amazing. So this is just a precursor. I'm gonna do a deeper piece on the hymn to Musaeus because I think it's really important. But what's most interesting about it is its unique structure and content. So it's the first positioned in the Orphic hymns, and it states right out of the gates. I've got it right here. What I think is most interesting about it is from Orpheus to Musaeus is what it says. So in the Orphic tradition, we see that Orpheus is writing this to Musaeus, and it's almost like a handbook. It says, now learn Musaeus, this most sacred rite, prayer surpassing every other prayer. All these other hymns within the Orphic corpus are hymns, prayers, invocations, petitions to specific deities, but this one has basically all of them. And Orpheus states, a prayer surpassing every other prayer. I'm reading this from the Patrick Dunn version. There's the Thomas Taylor, which is available online for free if you want to look at those yourself. But we're looking at a completely different structure in the hymns. Now there is an invocation and what seems to be sort of a development, which is close to the hymn structure. The hymns come in an invocation using epithets and specific names to call on the deity. Then it basically pumps up the deity with the development, speaking, reciting ecstatically the beauty of their mythology, of their story, kind of saying, yes, I know who you are, I know what you've done, and then it ends with a petition. Now, the hymn to Musaeus definitely has some of those elements, but it is markedly different than whatever all the other ones are. And I think there's a reason for that. Now, this is something that I'm writing a piece on, and I'll release it eventually here once I get it done. But this is not only like a super prayer, like to use in a pinch, like if I don't know which deity I need to go to produce a specific effect or to receive a certain purification or to invoke a certain energy. The hymns are all based around that. But I think this is also initiatory. This particular piece takes you through the entirety of the Orphic corpus in one hymn. And it shows you all the names that you're going to encounter within the back end of this for the most part. Some of them are more veiled in symbols, but or just a line here and here that says all of these particular spirits. But this is basically a cosmological map to what the Orphics saw when looking at the cosmos in general. And I've been kind of combing through it. And what's really interesting, if you look at it through a Neoplatonic kind of triadic lens, they present triads all the way through this thing. And so it's not just this like super prayer, but it is also a symbolic map of the cosmos, of how things are generated into matter and the specific groupings of three gods at a time. And again, this is another piece that I'll be putting together soon, but I'll show you a little bit of it here as we move on to the next slide. But this is a completely different hymn to Musaeus, and whether or not it's attributed to Musaeus, it looks like it's written by Orpheus for Musaeus, but as we know with all the hymns of the time, we don't know who actually penned them. In the tradition, it seems to be an initiatory piece where upon reading it, you are reading or reciting it, you are initiating yourself into the current and accessing all of the goodies therein. So, as I said, there's a triadic structure, there's a sophisticated cosmological understanding, and there is the dual purpose of it as initiatory and as something that's functional to basically say, if you don't know what you're doing with the hymns, say this every day. Say this one because it is the most potent, it is the most powerful. Now, I personally have engaged in stating each one of them, one per day, for a long period of time, going through each and every one of them. And it does have an initiatory effect. The recitation of poetry has an impact on the soul. It gets past the psychic sensor. It allows you to experience the mystic revelation of things. Once you really get into it, it feels goofy at first, but if you get into an ecstatic recitation of these things, give yourself some space within the ritual time to explore what that feels like after you get done with an invocation, after you get done with the recitation of the poem. If you say, and this is just a little trick, a goodie I'm giving you, if you've stuck with me this far, if you say the hymn to Musaeus first, and then each day do one of the hymns, Musaeus hymn, next hymn, Musaeus hymn, next hymn, it's an initiatory framework. It will basically initiate you into the entirety of the Orphic current without the rites themselves. The poetry themselves, I think, is more important in the Orphic idea of things, in the Orphic tradition, than all of the different rites, right? We know there was the orgiastic rites. We know there were all these ascetic rites. They were vegetarians. They didn't want to harm things. Those are all part and parcel of it. But at the core, the heart of the entire experience is the music. It's the poetry. It's the lyrics. It's the statement of ecstasy that happens when you engage with the poetry itself. So if you're looking for a way into the Orphic mysteries, you don't know how to get there, pick up one of the copies, read them every day, and it works on its own, in my opinion. Probably a lot out there who would disagree. So I want to look at the first couple of lines of the hymn to Musaeus. It says, "Now learn, Musaeus, of this most sacred rite, a prayer surpassing every other prayer." He begins with Zeus, Zeus the king, and Gaia too, Zeus and the Earth Mother. So we have a unity juxtaposed with an indefinite dyad, which we see within Pythagoreanism. So we have the beginnings of a triad: Zeus, the father of unity, a dyad, and then Helios, a triad. So if we're looking at this as Zeus and Gaia, almost like an inverted pyramid here, then at the bottom we would have Helios. Now, from Helios, he says, to holy heavenly flames of Helios and means the moon, the holy light, and the stars. So there's another triad, the holy lights. So there's a triad of the moon, the sun, and the stars. He goes on again. Poseidon, who fooled around the earth with your dark hair, holy Persephone and Demeter. In Platon, in Proclus, Poseidon acts as another form of Zeus. Everything is Zeus. Like, for the most part, everything is Zeus. This is why the monotheistic tradition took, because the polytheism of that time period, the philosophy of that time period was already monist. They already had a monad. They already had a unity, and the explosion of all of the division of that unity was already present. But the idea behind it was that Zeus was all these things, and that these are the different ways that Zeus manifests within the universe. And so you see Poseidon as distinct, but also the same, and almost on a different layer of reality. Platon puts Poseidon as the almost a demiurgic process at times. And I think that's interesting, putting him in a triad here, which is not one that you see in Proclus. You don't see it in Platon. You see Poseidon and Hera. Hera being similar and having the characteristics of the female to Demeter. Demeter being Rhea, Gaia, all these things. they basically line up to the same energy on different orders of reality, if that makes sense. So these triads kind of like spill downward, um, giving greater and greater condensation of matter from the higher forms or principles that Platonism is built on. So you've got Poseidon, Persephone, and Demeter. Persephone being this darkness, this dark womb. Demeter being the one who brings forth the fruits. So the Earth Mother. It's an interesting triad, and it's part of what I'm working on is trying to identify what this hymn has these triads in here specifically for, because they just come out in threes as you read it. You're like, oh, okay, next three. Then we get it again. And Artemis, the maiden who pours arrows, and Eos Phobos, you who dwell in Delphi's sacred plain. Artemis and Apollo, twins, born of Zeus, and Leto. There's a triad. And then you have Phobos, Apollo, and Dionysus, almost always a part of a triad. But in this case, you've got Artemis as a part of it. You see Apollo and Dionysus and Zeus all the time in a triadic formula. And now you have one here with Artemis, which I think is really interesting. It's almost like the having a feminine principle within some of these triads. It seems like you kind of have to have one in each and every one of them. None of these are all male dominated within this hymn, at least not to my memory. I'm still working through it, but you see another triad here. This one I'm not even sure what what to call it, but it's interesting. We don't see that anywhere else. But this one we do. We see this one in Hesiod. And passionate Ares, and the strength of Hephaestus, and the goddess born from foam, who won the gifts of greatest grace, Aphrodite. Everyone knows about the Aphrodite Hephaestus betrothal and how she sleeps with Ares all the time because she's in love with him, and this weird love triangle. Well, guess what? Boom, triad right within the hymn of Musaeus. So it's really intriguing, really intriguing stuff. So where are we at with all this? We look at the hymn, this poem, this poet guy, and then we have Moses, the lawgiver, the absolute intermediary. On one side, we have the Grecian, poetic, ambiguous oracle of Musaeus. This invitation to interpret yourself, to have a dialogue with the divine through poetry, to have this love affair with the divine. It is an invitation more often than not within this Orphic tradition, and that's the way that Musaeus is depicted by the Greeks. Well, it's very much like what the Greeks are. Their love of philosophy, their love of drama, their love of this poetic nature of reality, that's who they were. So if we're looking at the same guy, of course he's going to look way different to the Greeks because they're going to impress upon him their own cultural adornments, their own cultural garments. But if we look at Moses the Hebrew, lawgiver, receives the 10 commandments from God. Laws are clear, absolute, no questions. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. Do not kill, do not steal, do not collect $200. Forming the basis of the covenant with God and representing the Hebrew culture's fixation on divine authority and of obedience. This is the story of the Israelites, man. It's a story of disobeying, getting kicked in the ass, and then obeying again. That is the entire story of the Torah, of them disobeying, worshiping other gods, becoming idolatrous, and then being forced back into this monotheistic thing. I don't want to put it all into a framework like that, but that's the general narrative that you see going through the entire Tanakh. Is they stray, they come back, they stray, they come back. In a way, there's something poetic to that. It's from a completely different cultural perspective. And if you look at the Hebrew, just kind of culture in general, it's packaged. It's very put together. It's very well thought out, very well structured. It doesn't have that poetic flair that the Greek does. But what's interesting is merging these two things in the New Testament. You are taking this very structured, absolute, authoritative statement of the Old Testament, and you're mixing it with the Greek culture that is transforming itself from this poetic polytheism into this hyper symbolic apocalyptic revelation that is going to be Christianity. and you see this weird thing come out of it that we're all dealing with now, that is monotheism. And it's fascinating to track back, to look at, to kind of understand. But yeah, I'm gonna have to do more on this because I ran out of time just in general on putting this piece together, and I ran across so many exciting, interesting things, like even the differences between how Pythagoreans and Orphics um, basically ban the wearing of wool, which is another thing that happens in the Hebrew based on the direction and the laws of Moses. You have the Hebrews saying you can't wear wool for one reason, because the priestly adornments, part of it was wool. They wore linen underneath and they wore wool. And then you have the kind of famous thing that's talked about now: don't mix the fabrics. That's part of the kosher laws. Um, and then you have the Orphics and others saying not to wear wool as well, which I don't know if that goes back to the fleece from the search for the golden fleece or whatnot, but some fixation on the wool that I'll have to do a piece on. And then there's the deeper triadic structures within the Orphic hymns. And I challenge you, if you are into the Orphic hymns, go ahead and look at them and see what kind of connections you can make. But anyways, that's my spiel for today on how Musaeus and Moses are probably the same dude, looked at through different cultural perspectives. And I hope you enjoyed the show. If you have any questions, or if you're in there, I don't even know if I have anybody in here right now, but please drop in the comments if you have a question about something I brought up in this, especially on the replay.